Today I want to talk about strategies for overcoming depression. And of course, as Nicole mentioned, this is part of the Classes Without Quizzes series. And I always begin my classes with cartoons because I think humor is an important thing. This is appropriate because I think it tells us where we've been. This is the dawn of psychiatry. You seem to be depressed. Now, of course, things have advanced since then, and I'll explain some of that research and how things have moved forward since the dawn of psychiatry. One more cartoon that I think is appropriate as well. This is Eeyore when he remembers his Prozac. That's the way, I like it. Of course, and the reason this cartoon is so appropriate is because poor Eeyore, although he might feel better being on an antidepressant, will be at risk for relapse or recurrence if he's treated with medication alone. So this is an important fact that I think has interesting conceptual and practical implications. That medicine's good. I'm not against antidepressants. But often in these cases, there's more that's needed to prevent recurrence and relapse. So what I hope to do today is give you sort of a whirlwind tour of what is depression, what is the nature of depression, how do I know if I'm depressed, what's the prevalence of depression, how common is it? And then what I'd like to do is provide a brief overview of one psychological treatment strategy called cognitive behavioral therapy, which has considerable research evidence supporting it. I'll also describe some of that research briefly, and then move into some techniques that hopefully you can sort of take home and apply to your own life, whether you suffer from depression or not. Toward the end, I'd also like to just spend a couple minutes giving you some indication or help in terms of how do you navigate sort of the system and where can you get help, including self-help material, which I'm sure our library here will be able to help you with as well. And then we'll end with some questions for those of you who are interested. Depression's been called the common cold of mental illness, and it's been called the common cold because it affects about 10% of the population. More recent estimates are closer to about 17% over the course of the lifetime. And that's drastic. That's a huge number of people that are affected by depression. The term common cold is a good one in some ways because it suggests that it's very common. It's accurate in terms of the prevalence. The problem is it's a bit of a misnomer in the sense that unlike the common cold, depression affects people so drastically, both individually, their loved ones, and society as a whole. And it affects the individual on all levels, cognitively, emotionally, socially, biologically, and behaviorally. Diagnostically, in order to be depressed, one needs to experience a series of at least 5 out of 9 symptoms. And the first 2 of those symptoms, at least one of those needs to be there to meet diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder. One of those is sadness. In kids or adolescents, it can be irritable mood, or loss of interest. And what we're talking about is a pervasive loss of interest in things that you used to enjoy, that you've just got no zing with anymore. And so that's an interesting fact, and I'd like to point that out because technically you can be depressed without depressed mood. You can be depressed without experiencing sadness if you have a pervasive loss of interest as well as these other symptoms here. There's also another symptom is changes in appetite or weight. So we're talking both sides of the spectrum here. Sometimes people can experience an increase in appetite or an increase in weight or a significant decrease. In terms of the sleep criteria, that also can be on 2 ends of the spectrum. Insomnia, where people aren't getting enough sleep in the night, or hypersomnia, where people are sleeping for hours and hours a day and oversleeping and feeling very groggy all the time. There's also changes in activity. People can be experiencing where they're really revved up and kind of pacing and walking and just pent-up energy, which we call psychomotor agitation, or the reverse, where they're really physically slowed down and they're talking or moving more slowly than is usual for them, so much so that other people will notice it, and that's called psychomotor retardation. Fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of guilt, self-blame, or worthlessness is very common. A decreased inability to concentrate or make decisions. And then finally, and sadly, a high risk of suicide, either thinking about or planning suicide. And that can range in some ways from what we call more passive suicidal ideation, where people they're not actively suicidal, they're more having thoughts like, I wish I wasn't here, or I'd be better off dead. More active suicidal ideation is where you have those kinds of thoughts, an imminent plan or risk for suicide, where you're thinking about it a lot and you're contemplating doing that. And so it's a very devastating disorder, as you can see. It's this cluster of symptoms that go together that really dreadfully impact someone and how they're feeling. Well, how common is depression? Sometimes I think when you present numbers, it can be presented in a way that makes you feel like I'm not the only one. And I think that's a good part of presenting numbers. Sometimes presenting numbers can be seen as insensitive, as in this cartoon. I'm depressed, doctor. I feel insignificant. It seems like I've been reduced to nothing but a number in everyone's eyes. Don't let it trouble you. 62.5% of my patients feel the same way. Depression is common. As I mentioned, it's called the kind of common cold of mental illness. Over the course of 1 year, the prevalence rate is 4%, which means that there's 540 individuals living in Ontario in a given year with a major depressive episode. If you look at lifetime prevalence rates, as I mentioned before, it's 17%. So if you take that and multiply it by the population in Ontario, we're talking about 2.3 million individuals who are experiencing depression over the course of the lifetime. In the London Middlesex area, that would be 83,000 individuals. So we're talking about a whopping number of people who are suffering from this problem. Unfortunately, depression is also a gender-biased problem. The ratio is 2 to 1, where more women than men experience depression. Depression is also an episodic condition, meaning that it recurs again and again, and it's not infrequent. So if someone has had one depressive episode, on average, they'll have about 5 or 6 episodes in their lifetime, which on average can account for about 20% of their life, which is a tremendous amount of your life experienced with depression. Sadly, the risk of each future episode increases with each episode as well. So if you've had one episode of depression, the chances are about 50% that you'll experience a second episode. If you've had 2, the chances are about 70% you'll experience a third. And if you've had 3 or more, it jumps up to about 90%, the probability. That's a problem, and I think we need treatments that will help to prevent the risk of relapse, and I'll explain some of that later. It's not all doom and gloom, I promise. Depression can occur at any age. It most typically occurs in adolescence or early adulthood, but it can occur at any age. And I just wanted to briefly highlight as well the economic impact of depression. It's quite devastating to the economy. There are about, in a given year, 500,000 individuals in Canada, employed individuals in Canada who are on leave because of mental health problems. The number one reason is depression. It's a huge problem. The the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health estimates that annually mental health disorders cost the Canadian economy $51 billion. That's annually. And with depression, again, being the leading cause of disability. The banks have taken notice, as have many other Canadian companies, in terms of calling attention to this. CIBC, for example, found that the average absences were 95 for people with mental health problems compared to 40 with days with individuals with other health conditions. So more than double is because of mental health conditions. And again, depression is prevalent, the most prevalent among those. So they've put strategies in place to try to increase workplace mental health, and that's been a popular term, fortunately, in recent years. And I think the other good thing that's been happening recently is steps to reduce the stigma associated with mental health problems, and depression in particular. So that was the bad news. Let me give you the good news. There are effective treatments for depression. The two primary ones are antidepressant medications and various psychological treatments. Of the psychological treatments, I'm going to focus on cognitive behavioral therapy, although the other two that are mentioned there, behavior therapy and interpersonal psychotherapy, are also evidence-based practice. They're very effective treatments for depression. The reason I'm going to focus on cognitive behavioral therapy is there's a few reasons, and I'm going to give you the punchline of this talk right now. Cognitive behavioral therapy is very effective for the treatment of depression. It has been shown to be equivalent to medication, even for severe depression. Secondly, it reduces the risk of relapse considerably compared to antidepressant medication. And the reason I'm not covering the other two is just simply because CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, has been studied the most often. And so I'll be focusing on that. Just a brief comment about medication. Medications are and can be very helpful for people with depression, and there are a number of different classes of medications available. Typically what happens, and if you look overall, roughly 65 to 70% of people will experience significant improvement with antidepressant medications. And I think research continues to support that in many ways. So I'm not suggesting that this isn't a talk that's against medication, but simply is pointing to other alternatives, and alternatives also that speak to the reduction of risk of relapse. What a physician will do when they prescribe medication is it's basically trial and error based on your symptom set and your family history and what you've experienced. And they'll try a particular class of medication and get you up to what they call a therapeutic window. That's basically where you're experiencing enough improvement, but not too many side effects. And that's sort of the therapeutic window, and hopefully that'll work. They usually take between 4 to 6 weeks to kick in, and then can be helpful for people. So there's a number of classes. One is the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. These were developed long ago. They're not quite as effective as some of the other antidepressant medications, about 60% efficacy. The way they work, not to go into too much detail about that, is basically monoamine is an enzyme that breaks down neurotransmitters that you need. And monoamine oxidase inhibitors inhibits the enzyme, so it makes those neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, available more readily. The one downside of this type of class of medication is that people usually need to be pretty restricted in their diet. You can't have things that contain, like yeast, and things that are aged, like cheese and yogurts and beer, unfortunately, and wine. And so that's one downside for sure. And there's just a side effect profile that's not quite as good as some of the other medications. The tricyclic antidepressants came out long ago as well. They became very popular in the 1970s and still are today, and still are quite effective for the treatment of depression. The most popular certainly now are the what are called the SSRIs and the SNRIs. The SSRIs are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and the SNRIs are the serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. In a nutshell, what they're doing is they're preventing the reuptake of the neurotransmitter back into the cell, and so it allows the transmission from cell to cell, and that's specifically for serotonin in the SSRIs, and specifically for serotonin and norepinephrine in the SNRIs. They've got far fewer side effect profiles and are well tolerated by people, and seem to be effective medications. So again, one downside of any antidepressant medication are the side effects, which vary by the medication. So people can experience dry mouth, they can experience constipation, nasal congestion, dizziness. I mean, there's a number of different side effects potentially with different antidepressant medications. But in some cases, people find them very helpful, and in some cases, I think they're needed. This cartoon says, "You're in a good mood, Oscar." Zoloft. Just to move on to cognitive behavioral therapy, which again can be used in combination with medication as well. Many centuries ago, Epictetus in 70 AD said that people are not disturbed by things, but the view which they take of them. And that's sort of a statement that encapsulates the essence of cognitive therapy. Cognitive therapy, from its inception, has argued that the way people think very much affects how we feel and how we behave. And so cognitive therapy itself was developed by this person here, Dr. Aaron T. Beck, in the mid-60s. He's now 94, and believe it or not, still publishing and still very active. It was originally developed for the treatment of depression and was found to be very effective for the treatment of depression. And now the research has just gone, it's just boomed. And cognitive behavioral therapy is shown to be very effective. In fact, it's the treatment of choice for anxiety disorders. Maybe next time I'll give an anxiety disorders talk, but it is the treatment of choice for all the different anxiety disorders. Most organizations talk about it as the first line of treatment for anxiety. But it's been expanded into other problems as well: eating disorders, personality disorders, a number of different physical health problems, and more recently schizophrenia as an adjunct to antipsychotic medication. Time magazine in 2003 called cognitive therapy quick, practical, and goal-oriented, and focused on the fact that it deals with educating people, skill building, and problem solving, and basically helps them learn skills to deal with the problems that brought them into therapy. So you're not just band-aiding or kind of feeling better, you're actually dealing with the underlying root cause of the depression. And I'll talk about some strategies in a little bit about how you go about doing that. So there's three primary assumptions in cognitive behavioral therapy. The first is that how we think affects how we feel and behave, which nowadays is really a no-brainer in some ways, because I think we often realize that, although I think we sometimes have the wrong assumptions. As I'll talk about a little later, sometimes you think, I'm feeling depressed because I lost my job. Well, maybe, but it's actually the belief that's really driving that emotion. The second assumption is that cognitive therapy can be monitored. We can check into our thinking and not only monitor it, but we can change it. And the third assumption is that if you change your thinking, you can change how you feel and how you behave. So the cognitive model of depression, there's three main elements of this. One is what we call a depressive self-schema, which I'll explain, which then is believed to influence faulty information processing. And then at the more superficial level, influences what Beck called the cognitive triad, a negative view of oneself, the world, and the future. Now, the depressive self-schema, we all develop schemas for things we know about. If you're an expert in a particular content area, you have a schema for that. You have a framework and a sense of all the information. So in some of the areas of research that I study, I have a framework or a memory structure for all of this information. So if I read a new journal article, it doesn't take me as long as it might take someone who's new at that to read through that material, because it almost is automated. I've learned the jargon, I know the material, it kind of filters in very easily. That's really an efficient way of processing information for us, is to develop a structure or a schema for that. The problem in depression is people develop a negative or depressive self-schema. It's a view of themselves that's well organized and integrated and stays with them. And according to Beck's model, people develop this early in life, and what happens is this belief system remains dormant or latent throughout life until it's triggered later on by a life event. And once it's activated, then it starts to influence negative information processing. So we can have this belief system that, for example, I'm incompetent, or I'm worthless, or I'm unlovable, and it may not become activated until an event triggers it. Once an event triggers it, then we start to think faulty information processing. And what happens in depression with information processing is people have a bias toward negative material. They attend more to it, they remember it more. They have what are called attribution biases, for example. So something bad happens, and someone with depression will attribute it to internal, stable, and global causes. It's a negative thing. It's internal. It was my fault. It's stable. It's always going to last. And it's internal. It's something about me. Something positive happens to someone who's depressed. They think it's external, unstable, and specific. So you did well on an exam, or you did well, got a promotion at your job or something, and you think, oh, it's external. Oh, well, that was luck. That wasn't me doing that. It's unstable. It's never going to last, and it's global, or it's specific. Well, yeah, it might have been good in that, but you know, I suck as a parent, or I'm terrible at this, right? And so that's the kind of processing that goes on with depression. So a lot of negative thinking, a lot of, another thing is with faulty information processing is what we call if-then statements. So you can go on life merrily having an if-then statement of, if I'm accepted by others, then I'm worthwhile. And you can probably not be depressed for some time as long as the if happens, right? If I'm accepted by others. But what happens if there's peer or partner rejection? Well, if I'm loved or approved by others, then I'm worthwhile. What happens if that equation falls apart? So that's the kind of thinking we're talking about at that level. And what that does is it affects more superficial thinking. This is the kind of thinking that we have that flies through our mind all the time. Hundreds of automatic thoughts. We all have automatic thoughts, and hundreds of them. As you walked in here tonight, you probably had a number of automatic thoughts like, gee, I hope this speaker's interesting. I hope this isn't too boring. I hope the room isn't too packed, etc. But we have those thoughts about ourselves as well. And often those thoughts, we're not very aware of them. And because we're not aware of them, we don't ever test the validity of them. And the problem in depression is they become expert at processing negative information. It's processed so rapidly and so easily that it's very difficult to even question the validity of it. How many of you remember when you first learned to drive a car? Lots, right? When you first learned, do you remember how careful you were? The hand on the 10 and the 2. You were very careful of how much pressure was put on the gas or the brake. You wouldn't dare listen to music because it would be distracting. You're hyper vigilant to everything that's out there, right? But then you give yourself 2 or 3 months, and before you know it, you're drinking coffee, listening to AC/DC, and enjoying the landscape as you're talking to the friends in the back seat. I mean, and the reason for that is because all of those things that took so much effort at first became very automated. You don't even think about it anymore. And that's what's happening in depression, but for negative content. It's so automatic that you don't question it, you don't think about it. And so conceptually, I'm going to make sure I don't kick over my water here. Conceptually, it's a top-down process. It's the schemas that influence processing that influences our automatic thoughts. In treatment, we work the reverse. We start with dealing with automatic thoughts and helping people learn to understand them and check the validity of those thoughts, and then we move up to starting to work at some of the deeper underlying beliefs that are driving those automatic thoughts. As I mentioned or alluded to earlier, it's a stressor that usually activates it. So it's not just a diathesis is a predisposition, if you have a predisposition for depression. So it's called a diathesis stress model. You have the predisposition, and then the stressor activates that. And so that's what I was referring to earlier. And I'll just give you an example of that in semi-modern day lingo. I don't know how many of you have seen Shrek. If you haven't, you should. It's a great film, great series of films. So much meaning, you know, the depth of the onion and so on. But in Shrek 2, Shrek has just gotten married. Oh, actually, let me just take some artistic liberty here. I'm assuming that Shrek has a depressive schema, just for the record. So in this Shrek 2, he's really doing well. He just got married to Fiona. Life's great, right? And everything goes very well. And then he meets the in-laws. and for Shrek, that's the stressor. And what that does for Shrek is it activates all sorts of prior memories of times when he was distressed, of times when he was under attack, at times when he was picked on, and so on. And what that does in the moment, so those activated memories in the moment then trigger beliefs like, they should just grab their torches and pitchforks now. Or maybe even a deeper belief, I'm a worthless ogre. So that kind of demonstrates what I'm talking about by this diathesis stress model. Life can be good and go on, but then something triggers it that activates that belief system for you. And once that's activated, then trouble can start. Just want you to read the following. I know it'll probably be hard for people in the back, but I'm just going to flash something up and I'd like you to read it to yourselves. Is that too quick? Should I do it one more time? Okay, so what did people see? Paris in the spring. Did anyone see something else? Some people saw two thes. Yeah, so it was actually Paris in the spring. And the reason many of you didn't see that is because our brains are wired to look for consistency. It makes sense for us to try to, we expect certain things, and so we filter information that's consistent with that belief system. We don't expect to see two thes. I may see it in my students' papers and mark that up, but you don't expect to see that usually. And so because of that, our brain kind of filters that out, and we don't pay attention to it. Just one other example, if there's someone who doesn't mind doing a quick demonstration. I'm just going to have you name colors. Don't all jump out at once. Oh, someone at the back. Will you let me know if you can see them. Do you want to come? Do you mind coming up? No. Sorry to put you on the spot. You can even sit in this chair here if you. Is that all right? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to show a slide, and you can read, if you don't mind, tell me the colors from left to right, okay, as fast as you can. Like the actual color? Yes, the color of each word. The color of the word. Yeah, from left to right. Okay. Okay? It's not that hard. Right. Okay. Red, green, blue, yellow, pink, orange, blue, green, blue, white, green, yellow, orange, blue, white, brown, red, blue, yellow, green, pink, yellow, green, blue, red. Thank you. Now I'm going to put you on the spot one more time before she gets it. That was the easy one. Now I'd like you to do it again. Again, naming the color. Green, yellow, white, pink, orange, blue, red, yellow, green. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Thank you for doing that. This is a really early finding in psychological research, actually back in 1935. It's called the Stroop effect. And the idea here is that if there's colors, if there's words of colors that interfere with or are conflicting with the actual color, it'll take longer to name the color words which you experience. You did exactly what most people would do, right? That's good. Actually, kids who don't read fly through that, right? So we know you're literate. What happens in the Stroop effect is there's conflicting information. Because the content of the word is competing for your attention, it's more difficult to name the color of the word when it's inconsistent. So if you look at this example, it's much easier to say the word, the color green when it's G-R-E-E-N than it is to say the color red when it's G-R-E-E-N. Now, researchers a couple decades ago thought, well, if people who are depressed have an attentional bias toward negative content, then it should take them longer to name the colors of negative words than positive or neutral words. So for example, the word lonely would take someone who's depressed more time than the word caring. Why? Because it's competing for their attention. They have an attentional bias toward negative content. And sure enough, that's what you find. You find people who are depressed take way longer to name the colors of negative words than positive or neutral words. And that effect has actually been shown across a number of different mental health problems. People with eating disorders, for example, have difficulty naming the colors of words that have to do with food or body shape. People with anxiety disorders, words that have to do with their particular anxiety problem. So it does really kind of show you the power of our thoughts and how we have these pre-attentive biases towards certain expectations. So the goal of cognitive therapy is really to help people to change that, to help them to change how they're thinking about themselves so that they can change how they feel and how they behave. So the goals are really to monitor automatic thoughts, and I'll explain that in a minute, to help people learn to recognize the relation among how they think and how they feel and behave, to then start to test the validity of thoughts. I'm sure a lot of people have heard, you need to have positive thinking. I'm here to tell you it's not the power of positive thinking, it's the power of non-negative thinking. It's the power of evidence-based thinking, not positive thinking. Positive thinking is often unbelievable to people who are depressed. It's the power of evidence. And then to help people learn to change or substitute their distorted or unhelpful thoughts with thoughts that are more helpful and adaptive. And then eventually, and typically in work with cognitive behavioral therapy, you start to identify themes among those thoughts. You start to see that there's themes that link to those, which give us suggestions that there are deeper beliefs there and helps us understand what some of those deeper beliefs are that people have and help to change those as well. So I'll give you a quick overview, talk about the literature pretty fast, and then move into some techniques of how you can do that. So basically, for cognitive therapy for depression, there's two main elements. One is called behavioral activation, and the other are cognitive interventions. And then the third step is really working with people to prevent the risk of relapse. Behavioral interventions are things that you do to help people restore and enhance their functioning. Bit by bit, in a graduated way, you're trying to help them get back. Counteract withdrawal tendencies. Avoidance is very common in depression. And in some ways that makes a lot of sense. People are feeling lack of motivation. They feel zero energy. They're not able to concentrate. It makes sense. It seems logical to just kind of hibernate and not go and do things in the short term. Unfortunately, that keeps you in the hole. And so one of the things that you really want to start to try to do is help people learn to increase interest and pleasure in things that they previously had been avoiding. And they've been avoiding because it made sense. They haven't been experiencing pleasure. I often think about the pleasure as, it's almost like if you lost your taste buds, you probably wouldn't feel like eating very much. But if you just keep doing it bit by bit, that flavor will come back. And I think with depression that happens. It makes sense you don't want to do it. If I was invited out for coffee with some friends and I predicted that the enjoyment would be a 2 out of 10, I'm staying home. I'm in my pajamas. There's no way I'm going out, right? A 2 out of 10? Are you kidding me? That's too much effort. But if I actually go and push myself to go, I might realize actually it's a 5 out of 10 or a 6. I had a decent time, and it's the the negative thinking that kind of made me not want to go so much. So we'll talk about some behavioral interventions. Cognitive interventions I talked about a little bit. It's helping people learn to monitor negative automatic thoughts, to change them, and then eventually to change the core beliefs. So as you start to pay attention to the thoughts that are running through your mind, you'll start to see some themes among those thoughts. And as you chip away at the deeper beliefs, you start to, the more superficial automatic thoughts start to lose their power. So on to the research. Before I give you the technique, I'll just outline some of the research really briefly. One myth that's pervaded for a long time, probably since 1989, is that cognitive behavioral therapy is not as effective for severe depression, that it's only effective for mild to moderate depression. And what that was largely based on was a trial by the National Institute of Mental Health called the Treatment of Depression Collaborative Research Project. And this trial was huge. It was multi-site, multi-million-dollar trial. It was bells and whistles, in which they compared cognitive therapy to another psychological treatment that's effective called interpersonal psychotherapy, to a tricyclic antidepressant called imipramine. And it was really a very reputable study. What they did in a sub-analysis of that study is they looked at a sample of people who have Hamilton Rating Scale for depression scores equal to or greater than 20. The Hamilton Rating Scale is basically a clinician-rated measure of depressive symptoms. And so they looked at their group and they found that for severe depression, antidepressants were better than cognitive therapy. The problem is that their sample size was only 53 in that sub-analysis of people of 20 and over on the Hamilton Rating Scale, which is not a large sample size. And but because the study was so reputable, it was a multi-site, multi-million-dollar study, it gained a lot of traction. And so for years, people had been saying, cognitive therapy is not effective for severe depression. Rob Derubis and colleagues in 1999 did what's called a mega-analysis, which basically involves going to the original data of different studies on a particular measure, grabbing the data. So in this case, it was Hamilton Rating Scale scores. And so again, for the same type of sample, people who had 20 or higher on this, so severe. And they looked across the different studies and then pooled those data. So the Rush et al. Study found that cognitive therapy actually was better than antidepressants for severe depression. Murphy et al., about equal. Steve Holland and colleagues, a slight advantage for cognitive therapy. This is the study I just cited. And if you pool all those data, you find that there's no significant difference between antidepressants and cognitive therapy for severe depression. Now that was tricyclic antidepressants. We've got newer age antidepressants now, for example, the SSRIs. Rob DeRubis and Steve Holland and colleagues did a really beautiful trial. It's one of those trials you read and you go, man, wish I did that. What they did is they successfully treated everyone with either cognitive therapy or with antidepressants. So everyone, their episode of depression was successfully treated. Then what they did is they split people off into three actually arms. Cognitive therapy individuals who were successfully treated were followed up over a period of a year. They could have up to 3 booster sessions, but if you look at the article, very few people actually took them up on those booster sessions. The antidepressant arm was switched for half the people, then moved on to what's called maintenance medication. So they continued on the antidepressant medication over the course of the year. And the other half, who were successfully treated with antidepressants, were switched to a placebo arm. So they got a sugar pill for the year after being treated with antidepressants. These are called survival characteristic curves, and it's not survival of the patient, don't worry. It's survival in terms of how many people are still surviving a relapse, how many are still not depressed at that point. So if you look over the course of the year, the blue line is cognitive therapy. So they did really well. So cognitive therapy, and then you just follow them up, did extremely well. Antidepressant medication and then antidepressant medication continuance also did very well. In fact, there wasn't a statistically significant difference between those groups, although it does favor CBT in terms of percentage. The people who are switched to the placebo arm, you can see, really dramatically dropped. So only 25% of those people were still relapse-free at 1 year. So this suggests a couple things. One is cognitive therapy is equally effective to medication for severe depression long-term. That's good news. The second thing is that maintenance medication is also important. So what people prescribe now is maintenance medication where you're on an antidepressant for a period of at least 6 months. Usually it's up to 2 years post-episode of depression to reduce the risk of relapse. And that's important. What time do we go till?
10 more minutes, is that enough?
Okay, I'll try to hurry. Sorry. So that's good news. And some of the research I've done has shown that medication and cognitive therapy tend to be very similar in terms of depressive symptoms and some of those more surface level cognitions I was talking about. But where cognitive therapy really seems to change is some of the deeper organizational core belief stuff that takes place. That's maybe a reason why there's a reduction in relapse with cognitive therapy. So in a nutshell, no single treatment is best. Most have approximately equal outcomes, at least initially. There's evidence that combining treatments may help. And then if one treatment doesn't work, the good news is another may. So as there's many ways into depression, there are also many ways out. This table just gives a summary, and if you pay attention just to the last column, you know, antidepressant medications on their own, 50 to 60% will relapse, whereas in cognitive therapy, it's much, much less. So I'll give you some quick overview strategies for how do you deal with this and how would cognitive therapy work, or if you're going to try to do that on your own even. One is what's called behavioral activation. And as much as I like the Nike slogan, just do it, I think it can be a bit disrespectful for people who are depressed because they hear that. You're not working hard enough, you're not, just pull yourself up by the bootstraps. That's ridiculously unhelpful, right? Because these people, it makes sense they're feeling the way they're feeling and why they're not doing what they're doing because they feel terrible. And from a functional point of view, it makes very sense not to do much if you don't feel good. What's hard, though, is needing to move forward anyway. So activity, why you need to increase activity is because it helps us feel better, it helps us think more clearly, and it helps us feel less tired. And I think one motto I sort of tell myself regularly is action precedes motivation. If I wait, and this isn't in a depressed example, but if I wait in the morning until motivation magically descends upon me to go to the gym, guess what? I'm not going most times, right? If I wait for motivation, I'm not going to the gym. I know that. I tell myself, I swear to you, I do it a lot, action precedes motivation. I get my butt in the gym because once I'm there, I feel like doing it. The motivation follows. It finally catches up. And that's often true in life. So if you start something and you start getting at it, you'll find that the motivation will pick up. The reason we don't feel like doing it, and I mentioned this already, is when you're depressed, it's like you have some demon on your back sort of feeding the depression. So in addition to all the symptoms of lack of motivation and energy and concentration, you also have a lot of thinking like, oh, you're no good at this, you won't enjoy this, it's not as fun as it used to be, and so on. And that's going to keep you in the pit. And so to counter that kind of demon on your back, it's... You
can take until 8. We'll just have a shorter time so that people can
okay.
down.
Sure, thank you. I can breathe.
Yeah.
So to counter the demon on your back, it's important. Activity does help work against depression. The other thing is social connectedness. So I want to give you some examples of how you might go about doing that. What I often start with people, behavioral activation is really important because what it's doing is helping people get kick-started again. And when someone's severely depressed, it's amazing. Like the things they used to be able to do, they can't do anymore. It's very, very difficult. And the problem is you don't feel like doing it. So what happens is you're lying in bed because you have no energy. You beat yourself up for lying in bed. You have less energy. You feel worse. You beat yourself up for staying in bed. And the spiral goes down and down and down. And what behavioral activation does is it starts to turn that around. You do it even though you don't feel like doing it, little bit at a time. It starts to increase your energy. You'll start to gain a bit of pleasure. You'll start to think differently. You'll start to feel more energy. And it starts to turn that cycle around. And one way to start with that is to just do an inventory of your week. I'd encourage you to, this is an activity schedule. You'd basically fill in, for every hour of the day, what are you doing, roughly, for every hour of the day. And an inventory will be very telling. It's very telling. I get my graduate students to do this in a cognitive behavioral therapy class I teach, and they're amazed how they didn't realize where their time was spent on different things. This is like a store would do. They take an inventory of what they have, and it gives them a sense of what you need more of or what you need less of. So that's the first step. And then what you can do from that is you can start to get a sense of what you're about. How is my mood improved or not improved? So clearly watching Oprah is not good in terms of mastery and pleasure. I don't know if people can see that at the back, but the mastery rating is a 1 out of 10. The pleasure rating is a 3 out of 10. So mastery is really accomplishments, things that give you a sense of accomplishment.
Can you just describe it because we can't read any of it?
Sure, yeah. So there's just different things like getting up and getting dressed, walking the dog, having breakfast, doing laundry, dinner with parents, and so on. And they're all associated with different ratings of mastery and pleasure, accomplishment or pleasure. And so some things like walking the dog are higher. There's more of a mastery of 5 and pleasure of 7, for example. What people often notice is the things that they're more passively doing, they're less activated and they don't feel as good, so their mood is worse. Yeah?
You're writing as you do it, or you're planning ahead?
You're right. For the first week, you're just kind of writing what I've done each hour. And it's better to do it closer to the time so you remember what you did. At least that's what I find. And then you, from that first week, it's just taking an inventory. So I would encourage people, try to suspend judgment on that. Don't beat yourself up for, oh my gosh, I spent so much time in bed, or I just looked at the television. Just take an inventory and try to suspend judgment for that week. And then say, what can I learn from that? Were there times when my mood was better during the week than at other times? Are there times when I felt differently? What can I do about that? And then the goal is to bit by bit start to structure things that are antidepressant, things that will give you a sense of pleasure and accomplishment, little bits at a time, little doses at a time. It's like if you think of ascending a staircase, you'll pull a hamstring if you go 4 steps at a time. Go 1 step at a time, right? And that's what you're doing with this. Bit by bit, you're trying to build the repertoire to increase what you're doing. And that will certainly help. And definitely you won't want to feel like doing it. So I encourage people the night before, try to think of 2 or 3 things I'm going to do for pleasure, 2 or 3 things for mastery or accomplishment each day. What am I going to do? And try to get your day more and more scheduled. Because the lack of schedule makes passive activity. Passive activity makes you stew and ruminate more and causes more depression. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. The second piece is the importance of our beliefs. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we often think it's the event, losing my job, that created my depressed mood. It's not. It's the belief. Some people could lose their job and go, woohoo, I hated that job. Some people could think that job was so understimulating, I'm so glad it's forced me to find something else. Whereas other people, if they find that defines who they are, would be really depressed. There's some days I think both ways. No, I'm just kidding. So if you take a kind of more concrete example, say you walk down the hallway at work and a coworker doesn't say hi to you. You might think or feel sadness or anger. It's not really the coworker not saying hello that caused the sadness or anger, as much as we think that's the case. It's actually our belief. So in this case, maybe she doesn't like me, or she's angry at me, or he's angry at me. And so the goal really is to start thinking, okay, that's a possibility, but are there other alternative possibilities for what I'm thinking? What are the other options? Maybe that they walked by and didn't see me. Could be that there's some, well, I shouldn't say this. I was going to say socially inept academic. No. But, you know, perhaps they're having a rough day. Perhaps they're preoccupied. I mean, there's several reasons why someone may not say hi to you in the hallway, other than they don't like you. And so it's important to stop. And I really encourage people to try to treat your thought as a hypothesis, not a fact. Think of it as that's one possibility. It's not the fact. Just because it's not I feel, therefore I am. Right? It's I think, therefore I am. So over time, as you do that, you can start to change not only how you think, but you change how you feel. And then the loop doesn't go from the event through the negative thinking. At first, it's going to be a lot of deliberate work to do that. But after a while, you'll start to disassemble kind of the negative thoughts, and more evidence-based thinking will start to pop up more and more. So one way to do this is what we call a thought record. And if you want a really good self-help book that the library has, but it's taken out a lot, they should get several copies, is my pitch. It's not my book, don't worry. It's a book called Mind Over Mood by Greenberger and Podesky. And I've got a slide of it at the end as well. But it's a great self-help book because it's a workbook, and it'll help you learn to change your thinking and change how you feel by changing the way you think. So the thought record, the first column, there's a number of columns, and what I encourage people to do is just do the first 3 columns at first, just to get a sense of what their thoughts are and how that's affecting their emotions. So you just quickly write the situation. What happened? So this colleague walked by and didn't say hi. What were you feeling in that situation? What was your mood? Rate it from 0 to 100 or 0 to 10, whatever you like. And then what was the thoughts? Ask yourself, pardon me, what was I thinking just before I started to feel that way? And you write down all the thoughts that triggered in that event. And then what I encourage people to do, and Greenberger and Podesky in this book, Mind Over Mood, also suggest this, is to circle the hot thought. The hot thought's the thought that's really carrying the emotional charge. It's the one that's really driving that emotion. And the reason you want to circle it is because that's the thought you're going to look and start to evaluate the evidence on. There's 2 columns, evidence that supports that thought and evidence that doesn't. And the reason I like both sides of the equation is because, again, it's not pat answers, it's not positive thinking that's going to help you. What's going to help you is balancing the weight of all the evidence, both positive and negative. So you're going to come up with an alternative thought that's more helpful if you can really integrate both sides of the evidence. And I'll show you an example of that. Then you re-rate your mood. And the reason you do that is because if your mood hasn't changed, you need to figure out, did I identify the right thought? Do I need to look at the evidence in more detail? And so on. So here's one example. And I think in the interest of time, I'll just give one. Driving back from my daughter's place where I spent Easter. Sadness, 80%. The different automatic thoughts, I'll read them out because I know in the back you can't see them. They would have had a better time had I not been there. The grandkids and kids don't need me anymore. They didn't pay attention to me all day. So that's probably the hot thought. That's the thought that's really driving the emotion, is the grandkids and kids don't need me anymore. So then, to examine the evidence. What's the truth in this? Have I had experiences that tell me that this thought isn't completely true? One thing I really like saying to myself and encouraging other people to say is, if I had a friend who had this thought, what would I say to them? And the reason that's important is because it's so hard to be objective with our own stuff, right? It's much easier for us to be objective with other people's stuff than our own. And so if you can step back and ask yourself, what would I say to someone if I knew they had this thought? Or what would someone say to me if they knew I had this thought? And that can help us be a little more objective. Sometimes asking, if I'm not feeling this way, would I think differently? Because our thinking, again, is colored by our emotion. So back to this example. So the first 3 columns we've already read out. And the hot thought is the kids and grandkids don't need me anymore. Then it's a matter of looking at the evidence. What's the evidence that supports this thought? Well, I used to enjoy tying my granddaughter's shoes, but now she wants to do that on her own. What you want to write down here are facts. So what I like to think about is the supporting evidence, the evidence that supports that negative thought. I often think about like the prosecution. And the evidence that doesn't support it is like the defense. And the alternative thought is when the judge or jury sort of weighs the evidence and really comes up with a verdict. So the second supporting thought, my daughter and son-in-law have their lives together, they don't need anything from me. There's a bit of an assumption in there, so I'd probably help someone to make that a little more fact-based. Tina, the 14-year-old, left at 7 p.m., that's a fact. John, my son-in-law, built new shelves and cabinets in the family room. 2 years ago, he would have asked my help. So what's the evidence that doesn't support that thinking? Well, Bill asked for my advice on plans for addition to their home. My daughter asked me to take a look at some of the vegetables in their garden that were dying. I made my 5-year-old granddaughter laugh often throughout the day. Sally seemed to enjoy my stories about her mom as a teenager. And my 5-year-old granddaughter fell asleep on my lap. So it's not disqualifying any of that evidence, it's incorporating it. So the alternative thought in this case that tries to take in both sides of the equation is, you know, even though my children and grandchildren may not need me in the same ways that they used to, they still enjoy my company and still ask for my advice. So there still is, they still do need her, but in a different way. They paid attention to me throughout the day, although the attention wasn't as consistent as it has been in the past. So then you re-rate your mood, and it's down to 30, which is probably realistic. The goal, again, is to think, if I'm feeling a negative mood, check out my thoughts. If my thinking's out of line, I need to examine the evidence and try to realign my thinking. And if it's not, then I need to problem solve. There's sometimes I've worked with people who, you know, for example, they had a number of different problems going on in their life with abusive spouses and, you know, mom who was agoraphobic and couldn't get out of the house and they had to get groceries for it. They had a lot of stuff going on and needed to problem solve around how to handle some of this stuff. It wasn't just changing thinking. So, but I think changing thinking is really a key, often. Sorry, these are just different cognitive errors that often happen. So one of the things I want to do is get back to the model again. So if you remember, the bottom one is that thought I mentioned. The coworker didn't say hi to me. The thought, she doesn't like me. And then the emotions are sadness or anger. What that does is that relates to a higher order kind of belief, a value, a rule. I need to be accepted by everyone to be worthwhile. And then an even deeper belief, no one likes me, I'm not worthwhile. And so those things are functionally related. And so what you do is you try to, when you do the thought record, you'll start to see themes in the thoughts you have. You'll start to see that, wow, there's a real pattern that keeps coming up here. Maybe that's a clue for my deeper belief. And then you can start to chip away at the deeper belief. Some of those deeper beliefs, or what we call core beliefs, are organized in 3 main domains. One are helpless, unlovable, and worthless core beliefs. So the helpless core beliefs are things like I'm helpless, I'm powerless, I'm incompetent, and so on. The second set are beliefs that people have often related to being unlovable, unlikable, undesirable, etc. And then the third, which probably are actually, in my clinical experience, more ingrained, are the ones that, you know, I'm really just despicable, I'm a piece of garbage type of belief that people have. So what the reason I have a tree here is I think this is a good analogy of what's going on. You can take the automatic thoughts, if you consider automatic thoughts like a leaf on the tree, and you can pluck them off one at a time and examine them and look at the evidence, and that will do a lot to change your mood. But if you really want to change, you need to dig and get to the root and cut it off, right? And that's finding the core belief and helping people change that deeper belief that they have so that it doesn't nourish the negative automatic thoughts, or it doesn't nourish those leaves. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes what's needed is professional help for that. Just another example. So this kind of looks like Pac-Man, but this is from Judy Beck's book, who's the daughter of Aaron Beck, who developed cognitive therapy. And this is an example of a belief system where we have a certain filter. And we have a certain shape for stuff that we expect things to happen. So if you have a deep belief, I'm defective, things that are negative, that are consistent with that belief, are going to slide in there easily. So you fail to balance the checkbook, right in there, no question. You lose your keys, I'm defective. Like just instantly feeling that way, it just slides in there. And what happens to information that's not consistent is it bounces off. It doesn't fit. It's like a triangle. It bounces right off into cyberspace and it doesn't fit. The only way it fits is if you squish it into a negative. So someone says, well, you did a really good job today, or you look really nice today. Well, it's because of this, that, you know, I worked really hard on this or whatever. And it squishes it so what happens is that the evidence starts to build up here. And I would call it pseudo-evidence, not real evidence, but it's evidence that kind of builds up and keeps reinforcing a belief system that isn't true. And so what I would encourage you to do in this case is try to think of this example. And before something slides into that pre-existing belief, grab it and go, hold on a second. Is that really true? Is losing my keys evidence that I'm defective? Or is it what everyone does at different times? Or is it evidence that I'm overwhelmed at work or whatever is going on? And similarly, before a positive one just bounces off, grab it and hang on to it and ask yourself, says something about me. Maybe there's some truth to this. One quick comment on acceptance. That's a real popular thing right now. And the fact is we all have pain and suffering in life. And it's not to undermine it. And acceptance is also not resignation. It's not saying I give in to this. But acceptance is being more present, focused, and in the here and now. And sort of, rather than the future, which is anxiety usually, or the past, which is regret, being kind of more in the moment. Just as one quick example, say you send an invitation out to everyone in the community, and who shows up but the very person you really would not want at your party? But you sent the invitation to everyone in the community, and so you can't just say, sorry, buddy. And so you have a choice. You can follow him around into different rooms and make sure he doesn't swear or double dip or offend people or steal your stuff or break it. Or you can say, you know what, I don't like that he's here, but I'm going to accept that he's here and I'm going to get on with the party. And that's the only way you'll get on with the party. And so there's an element of acceptance with pain and suffering we have, where we kind of just have to, it doesn't mean things aren't changeable, but when things sometimes aren't as changeable, like physical pain, for example, kind of living and learning to accept and be in the moment more with it, rather than jumping to try to change it all the time, can be really helpful. Okay, I'm out of my time, so I'm going to just quickly, 2 minutes, give you a sense of self-help if I can. So this cartoon says, people are always saying, Lassie, go get some help. So here I am. This is the book I was talking about. It's called Mind Over Mood. Change How You Feel by Changing the Way You Think. It's by Greenberger and Podesky. It's probably the #1 book recommended for bibliotherapy or therapy by reading. There are a lot of good self-help books. I just encourage you, buyer beware. There are probably 5,000 self-help books that go on and off bookshelves every year. Norcross et al. 2013 talk about how probably 95% of self-help books do not have any scientific support and evidence. And those are the kind that you know, promise, you know, improve your sex life or change your grief or make some broad miracle kind of statements. I would encourage you to be healthy consumers of self-help material. And the way you can do that, I mean, it's not foolproof, but there's some things to keep in mind. One is to check out whether what they're talking about in this book is based on valid psychological principles, if you know that. If you don't, checking out that the author has credentials. Just because someone says they're an expert does not make one an expert. Tony Robbins is a good example of someone, no offense for those of you who might like Tony Robbins, but he's someone who calls himself a mental health, psychological expert of change. He's got no credentials or degrees in mental health whatsoever. So it's a fascinating thing to me that I obviously should have, had a different profession. John Gray is another person who wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Some people really love that book. He sold 15 million copies or something like that. But really his degree was from an unaccredited place, and he doesn't have a license to practice in the state he's in, so you wonder, right, what is it based on? So check the credentials of people. Often, not always, but often if people are from an academic institution, they're more likely to be promoting scientific stuff because their reputation's on the line. They don't make a reputation on selling books and so on. They make their reputation by having a name in science, and so that's often helpful too. Make sure you pick stuff that's specific, that gives you, like, for depression or for panic disorder or for social phobia, rather than this broad kind of promises. And I really encourage you as well, self-help books can be good. There's really strong evidence actually for self-help books that are evidence-based, often cognitive behavioral. There's evidence that they are, in some cases, for mild, moderate problems, as effective as seeing someone in treatment. I encourage you, though, if it's more than that, if it's more problematic than mild to moderate, to seek professional help. There's different websites. The Academy of Cognitive Therapy has websites for professional help. See your family physician for medications, or see a psychologist, either in private practice or the public sector. And then finally, I'll leave you with 3 websites. The Canadian Psychological Association has some, fact sheets that explain different issues and how to get help. The Ontario Psychological Association has a free referral service online, so you can go and click in your postal code and it'll give you licensed psychologists within that area. And the American Psychological Association also has that available. There's other sites that do too. I can go back to that in a second, but I'll stop now. Over time for questions. If anyone wants, does anyone want that previous screen back? So, yeah, okay, I will do that.